Hi, and welcome back to U.S. History with Mr. Snyder. Today, we get into the causes of the Great Depression. And while historians really don't have a set list of these things caused the Great Depression, these are the things that people can agree on. Your learning targets for today are to identify the weaknesses in the economy of the 1920s. While it was booming, it did show signs of only short-term growth that were ignored. We'll explain how the stock market crash contributed to the beginning of the Great Depression, and we'll describe how the Great Depression spread overseas. So let's go ahead and get started. Problems in the 1920s. Well, it's the decade after World War I, where farmers were growing more food, and farmers keep growing too much. There is a surplus of crops left over from World War I, and crop prices plummet, and farmers end up owing the banks more money, and the banks then foreclose on their homes and their farms so that they aren't able to pay off their debt, and they declare bankruptcy. The wealth is unevenly distributed in America, as we know from the factory workers versus the factory owners. The wealthiest 1% of America earn as much as the bottom 42% during this time. And they're not going to buy enough to keep the economy strong, and the bottom 42% don't have enough money split amongst them to keep the economy strong or to buy anything. And this contributed to the third issue, which was easy credit. There were too many Americans that were buying now and paying later. That's one of the problems with our most recent recessions, was too many Americans buying now and paying later. Credit card debt in this country is enormous, and we still haven't learned our lesson from the Great Depression. Let's get into the stock market. We'll kind of go out of order here in Learning Target 1, Learning Target 2. We'll skip back and forth. It makes more sense that way. But people are buying stocks on credit, and they're doing it not as long-term investments. So normally you buy a stock and you want to keep it over a period of years because you think it's going to increase in value. But people in the 1920s are gambling to make quick profits. If they buy a stock, if it goes up a couple pennies, they sell it. They've made that money. They do it again and again and again, and they're doing it on credit, and that's dangerous. Prices begin to slip in September of 1929, and investors begin to lose confidence in the market, which means they stop buying new stocks and start selling off their stocks that they have. So they sell their stocks. The money comes out of the market, and finally it hits rock bottom on October 29th, 1929, and that's known as Black Tuesday, appropriate since we just celebrated Black Friday. But there were 16 million shares sold that day. Fortunes for people were wiped out in a matter of hours, and people had nothing left. And then that contributes, and most people say that is the beginning of the Great Depression. It gets worse from 1929 to 1932. After the stock market collapse, banks begin to collapse because frightened people are worried that they're going to go, that they're not going to get their money back. So if everybody goes to the bank and tries to withdraw all of their money, it's not going to be there, because the bank loans out that money in order to make a profit on the interest that the people pay back. Banks don't have the money there all at once, and the people who didn't get their money back, they weren't able to get their money back. They lost it. The bank didn't have it. There was no insurance. There was nothing, so they lost it. And at that point, many banks fail or they close. Businesses also start to close as well because they begin to close plants, their stores, and they lay off workers, and it becomes a vicious cycle. Businesses lay off workers, so those workers spend less and buy less. So the businesses produce less and lay off more workers, so the consumers spend less, so the businesses make even less, and then they lay off more workers, and it becomes a cycle of poverty. And President Hoover and a lot of other economists thought that it was just a part of the business cycle. In the business cycle here, you can see we have our peak. This would be an area of peak. Then we recess, or we lay off workers until we get to a point where we recover, and then we're hiring workers, we're buying more stuff, and we peak. Then we may go into another recession. Then we may go into another recovery period. A depression is just a very severe recession. We may get to the peak and we may lay off people all the way down here. And President Hoover thought that the Great Depression was just the bottom portion of the business cycle, that he shouldn't interfere and it will get better. And we'll talk about that in a second. But that's the business cycle. And you can see overall in the business cycle a trend of growth, or moving up. This becomes a global disaster because of our ever-increasing trade globally. Our profits plummet, so we have no money to invest abroad. Our European nations cannot pay off the war debts at that point with the money we're investing, so their production plummets, which means they cannot afford any American goods, which means our profits plummet even more, and it becomes a worldwide depression at that point. Contributing to this in the 1920s was the fact that we raised our tariffs, and so did other nations. They raised their tariffs. It was designed to protect our American products from foreign competition, but when they raised their tariffs, it closed off entire markets and destroyed international trade. And because there's no money in Europe, Germany begins to cease paying for World War I, which means France and Britain cannot pay their debt payments to the U.S., and we don't have any more money coming in. And so that is the end of the causes of the Great Depression. Let's review here for a second. The 5 causes of the Great Depression are uneven distribution of wealth, easy credit, stock speculation or gambling on the stock, tariffs, such as the Hawley-Smoot tariff, and the collapse of the banking industry. So hopefully you got your learning targets finished. Make sure you fill them out thoroughly, and I will see you tomorrow. Goodbye.